Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Changing Hands Bookstore, your independent bookstore. Since 1974, I am your host tonight. My name is Eddie, and very happy to welcome you all back. I don't know about you, but this whole summer hiatus thing, I've been jonesing for some really good history, so I'm very, very glad to have back our friends from the ACMRS. We really appreciate having you here and finally learning something that wasn't shrouded in the depths of history over the years. So thank you for coming out, and thank you everyone for joining us. Now, while most of you were gone, Changing Hands Bookstore's second location has opened over at 3rd Avenue in Camelback. That's just west of Central and Camelback. If you haven't made it over there, you're definitely going to want to stop in for a few minutes and take a look. The coffee, beer, and wine bar is a very, very exciting feature for many, especially those caught up with which book do I choose. Let's have a glass of wine. Think it over. It's proved to be a nice place to hang out, and the building itself was once known as the Beefeater. Some of you may be familiar with that. So the building has gone through some changes, some renovations, but still has its old charm, fireplaces, and warehouse flooring, and so forth. So it's got a lot of really wonderful and quirky concepts that I think all of you could appreciate. Thanks for supporting us over all these years, because the second bookstore could not happen unless folks like yourselves showed up here and then accidentally wandered off and bought a lot of things on the way out. That just tends to be what keeps us in business. So thank you. Thank you for supporting this event and future events at this bookstore. At this time also, if you might have a cellular device or something like it that might start ringing or chirping in the middle of our conversation, we don't want to miss a thing tonight, so please, just feel free to turn the phone off altogether. It's scary at first, but then it gets easier. Yes, hi. Arizona Storytelling at Changing Hands Phoenix. Is that a 7 o'clock start? That's the one thing as an event host, I've been good at weighing out what happens in this store, and I haven't quite gotten the hang of balancing out which events are over there or here. 6:30 or 7? Good. You can go to changinghands.com to look up all the events that are taking place, workshops and such. You can also sign up for our email blast, our newsletter. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and that's about the best way to keep up with us around here. So at this point, without any further ado, I'd like to welcome back to the stage the man, the myth, the legend, Bobby York.
Hi. It's kind of a weird introduction. I'm not a myth or a legend, but I am a man. I'm the director of the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, and it's a pleasure to welcome you back to the first lecture in our third season of Fearless Females, Audacious and Feisty Women of the Middle Ages and Renaissance. We'd like to thank the women of the Middle Ages and Renaissance for being so numerous. And we'd like to thank the program in Gender and Women's Studies at ASU and Changing Hands Bookstore for hosting this or co-sponsoring this event for the past 3 years. In the first or second year of the series, you may have already heard tonight's speaker speak. I had the pleasure of introducing her then as one of the bright new stars in Renaissance studies, and I wished her well. Since then, she's kept in contact with ACMRS. She's come to our conferences in February, and she applied for the position of assistant director of the center last year, and I'm delighted to report that she achieved that post from a slate of very strong candidates, and we're delighted to have her here. She's been here since May. So you'll be seeing her again. After completing her bachelor's and master's degrees at SUNY Buffalo and the University of Tel Aviv, respectively, Sharonah Fredrick worked for 15 years in Latin American and Middle Eastern ethnography and literature, teaching at the Overseas School of Hebrew University in Jerusalem and guest lecturing at the Anahuac University in Mexico City. She specializes in Mayan and Andean literature with a subspecialty in Judeo-Spanish folklore, currently completing her doctorate in Hispanic language and literature at SUNY Stony Brook, and she'll be defending her thesis next month. Right.
2 months.
2 months?
December.
Uh-oh. The date keeps getting pushed back. I'll hold you to 2 months. And she'll be returning as Dr. Sharonah Fredrick. At SUNY Stony Brook, she was the 5-year recipient of the prestigious Turner Scholarship, as well as receiving the Tinker Travel Grant for research in the Yucatan Peninsula, and a special Turner Summer Award for travel to Peru and Chile. Sharonah speaks, reads, and writes Spanish, Hebrew, and English with fluency, and it remains to be told which of those languages she'll be using tonight. And she also speaks and reads Portuguese. In joining ACMRS, Sharonah has joined our recently appointed research professor in medieval studies, Professor Jaime Lara, and he also specializes in Latin America. He will be giving a special talk in our ACMRS lecture series on Thursday, September 4th, entitled, and it'll be here at 7 o'clock, Apocalypse in the Andes. It's sure to be a brilliant and well-illustrated lecture, and I hope you'll be able to attend that. These two scholars give ACMRS a breadth and strength we previously didn't have. We'll be developing a number of programs in medieval and Renaissance Latin America in the coming months and years, so please stay tuned. For now, I give you Sharonah Fredrick, who will be talking to you about African warrior princess of Brazil.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Can you hear me? Without it? With it? 4 years ago, at New Jersey City University, a student of mine, African American, asked me why it is that black people don't appear in history books before the 1960s. And I thought about that question because our conception often of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance is entirely white, which is a bit ridiculous because the world has always existed and human beings have always existed, but we tend to silo certain groups out. So I think you will agree with me that it is extremely important to bring the rest of the world into the period that we call the Renaissance. So when I talk about Aqualtune, I'm talking about one of the two most important women of the 17th century. By the way, you may or may not know that two of the most important people who ever lived in the 17th century were women. I'll mention the other one at the very end. Can you hear me? Is this all right?
Closer.
Maybe better without? Yeah, it tends to be pretty loud. You can hear it without. Is that all right? If I move over here, is that all right? Yeah. All right. There was slavery in Brazil until 1888, which is a bit longer than we had in our own country. Slavery ended in our own country here in the U.S. in 1863. So we're going to talk about a woman who led the first interracial slave uprising ever, who established the first interracial settlement in the New World ever, and you've never heard of her. Am I correct in saying probably nobody has ever heard of her? So she has been utterly airbrushed, let's say, from the pages of English history books, English language history books that deal with the Renaissance, where she definitely should be there. Correct? We won't get into why she's airbrushed right now. I will mention at the end why I think she was airbrushed. First, let me tell you why she's important. Because if you're here on a Tuesday night, when you could be outside doing something more fun, and you didn't come for me, because most of you don't know who I am, which is fine. You came for her, and I want to keep the spotlight on Aqualtune. It's because there was something maybe a little bit different about this. And part of that has to do with the issue also of incorporating everybody into the study of that period called the Renaissance. And when I use that word, I'm referring to from 1450 to 1700. So it's kind of funny to use the term Renaissance. I'm going to prefer to use another term, early modern. And the reason I do that is because a very great living scholar two very great living scholars. Serge Gruzinski in France and Henry Louis Gates. Does anybody know him? You should know him if you don't know him. One of our most important historians at Harvard pointed out something which shouldn't need pointing out, but yet I have to point it out, that what we call the Renaissance is also the period of black slavery. It's also the period of the hecatomb, the total destruction of so many Native American cultures. I am not diminishing for 1 minute the importance of what was the Renaissance in Europe, but I will say this very clearly, Europe is one part of the world. It's not the only part. And right now we're in the Americas, so we do have to understand something about the Americas, which were tremendously influenced by Europe, but we also have to understand this in the context of New World history. So why is Aqualtune important? Who is Aqualtune? Let's take a look first at slavery in the New World. You see, I can talk, but operating PowerPoint is something that... Hold on. It's going. Yeah. Thank you. This is the wonderful person who actually helped me make the PowerPoint presentation. I don't think I could have done that by myself. There are some facts I do want you to know. When we talk about slavery in the New World, that is including the United States, by the way. There's a misconception that all of the slaves who came to the New World came from, hello Z, I'm sorry, I just saw another friendly face. Totally embarrassed me. That all of them came from West Africa. 80% came from West Africa. The woman that we're going to talk about this evening came from West Africa. And they were taken from West Africa because of their superior skills in agriculture and metallurgy. Well, that's quite interesting because, you know, if you are accustomed to one particular retelling of history, which would make the slaves or the people who were taken as slaves very ignorant and need to be civilized, what's quite interesting is that the Spanish and the Portuguese, who are the first slave traders, England and Holland come into it later. So does France, but it begins with Spain and Portugal. If you want the year, it's 1501. They actually wanted these people because these people knew more than they did about agriculture and metallurgy. The other 20% were taken from East Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. So the area called Brazil, which, by the way, if anybody wants to know the original name for it, the Tupi-Guarani Indian name was Pindorama. Brazil is just the name of a type of tree, Brazil wood, which is the reason why it became such an important colony. So the black slaves who were taken to Pindorama, what we are now calling Brazil, came from both places. And Aqualtune, where did she come from? We know she's important because she leads the first slave uprising. That's interracial. That also tells you, were there white slaves? Oh yes. If you were in the Portuguese or Spanish colonies, there were white slaves, there were black slaves. The overwhelming majority were black. But a white, poor Portuguese farmer could be sold into slavery due to debts. Have you ever heard of the term indentured servant in English? All right, so some servants could be indentured so long in the Portuguese colony that they would simply become slaves themselves. So, you know one thing about Aqualtune, which is awfully interesting, she manages to bring a non-black component into the slave uprising. In fact, that is really the only reason we know who she is, because there had been many slave uprisings in Brazil prior to Aqualtune. But she does one thing that scared the living daylights out of the colonial authorities. She brings black, white, and Native American together. That is a threat. That is going to terrify the Portuguese crown. Where did she come from? We think Angola. We think that because according to the Portuguese chronicles, she spoke Bantu. And we know that she fought the slave traders of the Congo. Don't worry, I'm going to give you her life in 1 minute. What I want you to understand right now is why she's important and why we're talking about her. Because while she is well known in Brazil, she really is hardly known outside of it. And in Angola and the Congo, she's almost persona non grata, because she brings up a very uncomfortable point, because she was fighting black slave traders as well as white slave traders. She was a woman, And she led an army of roughly 10,000 men. So how could she get airbrushed out of history? Well, because the men who wrote history in the 19th century thought she was a very bad example. So her grandson, Zumbi, is celebrated all throughout Brazil. And on November 20th, everybody in Brazil marks the day that Zumbi was killed by the Portuguese colonial authorities. And Aqualtune is mentioned as his grandmother, which makes you think that she was sitting there basically knitting sweaters for him. So she's airbrushed twice. She's airbrushed as a black woman, she's airbrushed as a woman. And then she's airbrushed as the leader of an interracial uprising, because that just frightens everybody. So she comes from somewhere here, she's brought here, and she does something nobody had done in the New World till that time. She also establishes, by the middle of the 17th century, the first interracial settlement in the New World, where there was what you would call complete equality. And I don't even want to use a term like between the races, because there happens to be one human race. So I will say between people of different backgrounds. Here we often forget that when we talk about race. We silo people into places they shouldn't be siloed into. One interracial settlement that lasted approximately 100 years, it was called Palmares. Is this in the history books? It's in the Brazilian history books. How many of you have ever heard about it? So we have to ask why, and we'll ask why after I tell you her story. So who was she? Here comes the difficult part. The difficult part is making the power. Getting better. Is this Aqualtune? Hell no! We don't know what she looked like. We have no idea what she looked like. But we only know about her from second-hand sources, and this is something very common with women in history, by the way. Because women were usually considered, unless they were reigning queens, as she was in either Angola or the Congo, briefly. When she was brought to Brazil, she's a slave, so she is certainly not considered worthwhile to speak about. She's born somewhere around 1580. How do we know that? We have no birth certificate for her. But we know that she led thousands of Angolan men against slave traders from the Congo who had a huge business with the Portuguese. Let me give you a little bit of background here. Black slavery begins in what year? Let me test you, I just said it. 1501. So black slavery was very recent when Aqualtune came to power. She was a local princess, and tribes in the Congo against whom she was fighting were making forays into Angola to kidnap people and sell them to the Portuguese. She does not agree with this, and at a battle whose name we do know. We know that because it was famous enough to be written about by Arabic historians and later by the Portuguese. The battle is called Mbawila, that's M-B-W-I-L-A. She led a charge of at least, according to the Arabic historians, over 6,000 men. She was not the only fighting woman. Many, many societies in West Africa were matriarchal. Okay, if any of you ever visit today the country of Ghana, you will find a country where the Ashanti tradition is entirely matriarchal. Okay, she wasn't the only queen, but she was the only warrior queen. And she fought like hell, and she was taken prisoner. By who? By whom? It wasn't by the Portuguese, it was by the Congolese slave traders who will then sell her to the Portuguese. I'm mentioning this to you because to understand Aqualtune and the political debates that she will get into later on in Brazil, you have to understand that her distrust of slavery is not a color thing. She distrusts the Congolese every bit as much as she distrusts the Portuguese. And you're going to see when she gets to Brazil, she will trust white people and black people to the same degree or neither. I mention this also because, interestingly enough, many years after Aqualtune had died, other historians in Brazil had no problem talking about slave uprisings that were not interracial. But her interracial uprising will terrify people. So she's born around 1580, either Angola or the Congo. She spoke Bantu. According to the records of the time, she also spoke 17 other languages, which is not uncommon for Africa, which is, by the way, the most hysterically multilingual place on the planet. And she was sold as a slave by Congolese traders after leading an uprising against both the Congolese and the Portuguese. So, she's raped on the slave ship that leaves a place called Elmina. And if there's any place that should be notorious, it is this place, Elmina, which is a huge garrison. It is located today in Ghana, from which first the Portuguese and later the British will take their slaves. When she gets to Brazil, she is already 6 months pregnant. The only reason she had not been thrown over the ship, by the way, what records am I quoting? You know she wasn't writing this. I am quoting to you from Portuguese slave records. So our image of Aqualtune is complicated because it certainly wasn't written by those who would be sympathetic to her. Correct? It's written by those who were her slavers, and then from Brazilian oral tradition, which will be quite a bit more sympathetic to her. But we know from the slave records the fact that she became pregnant actually temporarily, quote-unquote, saved her. Because she was considered to be fertile, and so she was brought as a, quote-unquote, breeder. And this was a rather hideous practice, begun by the Portuguese, continued by the Spanish, and very popular in the American South, where black women basically were raped and had children until they expired and died. So that was what she was brought to Brazil to do. They didn't know what they were bringing. They didn't know what they were bringing. And they didn't understand, apparently, one thing about what was going to be her political philosophy, which is, remember, she had been a princess. She was a politician. She knew how to make coalitions. And she's going to be able to do that in Brazil. Let's take a look at Brazil. You see the word quilombo. This is the name of the free multiracial settlement that she founds, creates. And of course, if you go to Brazil today, you will still find many quilombos. Except the word has different meanings in different places. So what exactly does the word mean? It's a Bantu word. All it means, what it means lexicologically in terms of vocabulary, is settlement. The Portuguese interpretation is an illegal or criminal settlement. And in Argentina, when you say, "Ay, que quilombo," what you're saying is, what chaos. So this also tells us a great deal about how she was interpreted and how dangerous the movement was that she creates. She gets to Brazil in 1607. And she is first sold as a slave up here in the north. Okay? Remember also when the Portuguese come to Brazil, the first settlements are all along the coast. The Tupi-Guarani Indians have been pushed inland. So the Portuguese need black slaves as their quote-unquote cheap labor. She escapes 1 year later, and in 1608 she leads the first slave uprising. And that slave uprising, which begins about here and spreads almost down to here, is the first one in which non-black people participate. Now, how does she do this? It appears she learns Portuguese very quickly, something you should not be too surprised about, because remember, she already spoke many, many languages. And in West Africa, this is very, very common. She also began to reach out, apparently, this is what the Portuguese chronicles tell us, to poor Portuguese people who came to trade with the plantation on which she was enslaved. She was a politician. I don't say that in a bad sense. She needed those skills. She had those skills. And in that first slave uprising, she's considered dangerous enough for a price to be put on her head. And for the then King of Portugal, who happened to be the King of Spain, because Portugal had been temporarily swallowed by Spain for about 60 years there. So that was Philip III. Felipe el Tercero personally puts a price on her head. She is considered a wanton woman. Why wanton? They don't know anything about her intimate life. Why is she considered wanton? What do the Spanish and Portuguese chronicles tell us? She has been caught walking in the fields with people of different colors. So this is interesting because it says she was very much viewed as a threat. They very much understood there was an alliance being created, some form of alliance. Something was going to be a threat to the Portuguese/Spanish crown. She escapes, and she comes to a place called Palmares. We know about Palmares before Aqualtune escapes to Palmares. It was an independent settlement of black slaves who had fled there earlier. She did not create Palmares, but what she does, and this is very important, is to rebuild it and restructure it so that it becomes the first interracial settlement. Now, what were her reasons for doing that? We can only guess. I don't know what her reasons were. I do know that because of what she does, we begin to have in Brazil multiracial uprisings actually all over the place in the late 17th and all through the 18th century. Something which also marks Brazilian history as notably different from American history on this point. So in Palmares, she creates a three-way alliance. She reaches out to the Tupi Indians who have been pushed into the woods, and she invites them to Palmares. She reaches out to poor white Portuguese who might have been loyal to the crown when they arrived, but have very little reason to be loyal to the crown afterwards. Because if you were poor white in Brazil, bluntly, your status was hardly better than that of a black slave. And in a way, it was almost as precarious because of your debts, you could be sold into slavery. And an interesting historical fact, if you were white and sold into slavery, it could also be perpetual slavery. So Aqualtune knows this, she sees this, and it is under her, shall I say, regime in Palmares that whites and Indians join the settlement. Okay. So the settlement is called a quilombo. Palmares is the first quilombo, and during the 17th century, under the influence of the Palmares quilombo, you have the growth of over 200 quilombos in Brazil. So these are interracial settlements which start springing up. Of course the Portuguese crown hates them. Of course they do everything they can to exterminate them, but they can't, because there are people of different colors there. It would have been very easy to exterminate them had it only been black slaves. So Aqualtune is an intelligent politician. She knows that to survive you have to make alliances. That's what she does. What was Aqualtune's philosophy? Again, we can only take this from the Portuguese chronicles. But it's interesting. We know she believed in a multiracial coalition because the Portuguese chronicles write that for over 60 years, by the way, she dies around the age of 95. For over 60 years, she trains, she dares to train, as they say. Poor whites, fugitive whites, diabolical Indians, and of course, black slaves, who was just worse than anything from the Portuguese standpoint. She trains them in fighting techniques. She was apparently doing this through her 70s. So, she creates a multiracial coalition. She is reputed to have distrusted the Portuguese and the Africans equally. That's completely understandable because her own experience in Africa was fighting other Congolese who were trying to sell her people into slavery. Why is this point interesting? Why is it even there? Because she's one of the few people in history, I have to say, not only Renaissance history, who transcends the racial paradigm in all ways. In all ways. She also believed that men had absolutely no leadership capability. Absolutely. And that was something which the Portuguese chronicles write about because it was something which made them call her a witch. Of course, we know that she's going to be branded a witch. This is not so unusual, and it's not 21st century radical feminism that I'm giving you. Remember that many of the societies in West Africa were matriarchal. Many, many still are. And when the leader is chosen, and by the way, this continues in Ghana, chosen by women. Okay, it is the female elders who choose the leaders. Aqualtune believed that men could fight well, but that ultimately the final decision should lie with women. And this was something which I think is absolutely groovy, and it was something which, of course, the Portuguese were very frightened of, because remember, the issue of female power will always be connected with witchcraft. And the 17th century, in Portugal and in Spain, was the century in which most witches were burned. Yeah, that's kind of interesting, because as we go closer to that period in history that we call the Age of Enlightenment, we have this kind of strange idea that history is going forward. So the Middle Ages were horrible. We get out of the Middle Ages, we get to the Renaissance, everything is reborn. The Renaissance, that wonderful, happy period in which all this stuff was written. And then we get to the Age of Enlightenment. Well, isn't it interesting that as we get closer and closer to the Age of Enlightenment, we're burning more and more witches? So something to think about. So that issue of female power is something which also made her very hated and very feared. She was a devoted mother, grandmother, and a military general. She raised 3 children. Her daughter, Sabina, by the way, her daughter Sabina was named after the Portuguese midwife who had run away to the Quilombo and helped Aqualtune have the child. Her daughter Sabina becomes the mother of that famous person I mentioned, Zumbi, her grandson, who leads an almost Brazil-wide coalition against the Portuguese, and he's killed, but his message goes on. She dies in 1675. The year of her death is marked by all the Portuguese chronicles. We have 2 very, very different versions about how she dies. Now keep in mind, she's born around 1580. We know that because she's taken prisoner in 1605 after leading that fight against the Congolese slave traders. But she couldn't have been 16 when she did that. She's probably in her mid-20s. She lives to be a very, very old woman. The Portuguese claim that they killed her in battle. If that is so, she was 95. Kind of extraordinary woman. Here I think I'm going to go to Brazilian oral tradition. Brazilian oral tradition says that she was helping to train the soldiers on the Quilombo to fight the slavers who would always come into the Quilombo and kidnap people. and that she simply died quietly one day during the overall rebellion, which I think is probably more likely. Remember in the Portuguese chronicles, they demonize her and they make her appear to be a bit witch-like. Most 95-year-old women could not wield an axe, but God knows. Maybe she could. What was life like in the Quilombos? Let's talk about that, because to understand why she's so important, this is really what you have to understand. Remember, this is the 17th century. Remember, this is Brazil in the 17th century, where there is no freedom of religion. We have a very nasty institution called the Holy Inquisition, which will make sure there is no freedom of religion. And by the way, the irony is that although, of course, the Holy Inquisition was designed to, quote-unquote, represent the Catholic Church, actually the majority of its victims in both Brazil and Peru were actually Catholics who were considered to be heretical. So it is simply an instrument to enforce religious orthodoxy. There is no freedom of religion. In the Quilombos, there is complete freedom of religion. And what was the dominant religion in the Quilombos? So I'm going to teach you a new word in Bantu. But if you go to Brazil, everybody in Brazil will tell you the word is Portuguese. It's not Portuguese, and nobody in Portugal knows it. In Brazil, they know it because it's become part of the culture, and the word is orixá. And orixá means force of nature, what we wrongly translate as God or goddess in English. This is the religion, one of the religions of West Africa, the dominant religion of Angola, the Congo, and Nigeria. The orixás were forces of nature identified, for example, with thunder. When you hear thunder, right? Out here in Arizona, when you get your monsoon rains, Shango. It's the god Shango. And Shango blends then with the Catholic saint Santa Barbara, because Saint Barbara is connected also with explosions, right? And military might. Every orixá becomes connected with every Catholic saint. And this is a wonderful process that Professor Jaime Lara will also touch on when he has his talk of syncretism, religious syncretism. So you can be, if you were living in the Quilombo, you could be a worshiper of the orixás, you could be Catholic, you could be Jewish or Protestant. That was a real no-no under the Inquisition. But there were escaped Jews and escaped Protestants who got into Brazil and were living very, very quietly because they would be expelled and or burnt if anything was actually said about them. Or she welcomed them too. Again, you can say it's simply because she was an intelligent politician. What's wrong with being an intelligent politician? Most of them are stupid. So she was an intelligent politician. So there were worshippers of the Yoruba African religion. Right? There were worshippers of Catholicism. There were Sephardic Jews. That's me. That means Jewish of Spanish or Portuguese background. Some of my ancestors were, I'm sure, hanging out with her. There were Protestants. In fact, the worst thing that she did, she was rumored by the Portuguese chronicles to actually have people who deny God at all. Oh dear. One or two atheists showed up in the Quilombos. So the Quilombos obviously become much more of a threat, you can see this now, than what would simply have been a limited slave settlement. So she reaches out. Does this mean she creates a feeling that goes against slavery in the white population? Yeah, she certainly does. She certainly does, and it's not accidental that we have so many poems and so many later on books and so much oral tradition from white Portuguese areas in northern Brazil. The area specifically called the Sertão, which is an area where very poor white Portuguese settled, praising Aqualtune and calling her their savior. Okay, if you are a radical Marxist, I'm not, but this is just interesting. If you are a radical Marxist, you could say this is class over color. Correct? Wrong! She wasn't a peasant, guys, remember. She's from the upper class. Okay, she is from the elite. She was a princess. And this is also very understandable because only somebody from the elite would have had her leadership skills. Okay, something to think about. So we can't confine her either in Marxist terms or capitalist terms And I can't stand when historians do that because, frankly, neither Marx nor John Hume nor anything identified with what we now call capitalism or socialism really existed at that time. So let's not classify her into that. She certainly wouldn't have called herself a quote-unquote revolutionary. She was a believer in the Orishas, and we know the goddess she was a devotee of, a very interesting force of nature called Nana, who in the Yoruba religion represents the female huntress. It's a very good image for Aqualtune. Female and strength. All right, now try to imagine what the Spanish and Portuguese crown, because remember, she's living in the period in which Spain and Portugal are united, which meant basically Spain took Portugal and said, "You're united." That was Spain's very gentle way of uniting things. Imagine what they felt at seeing this quilombo and other quilombos spring up. And imagine how angry they felt when one group within the Catholic Church comes out entirely in support of her. Those are our friends, the Jesuits, who are often out on a limb. But what is our Pope now? The Pope is a Jesuit. And of course, the current Pope made quite a point when he visited Brazil of visiting Palmares and laying a rose on Aqualtune's monument. I can't say her grave, we don't know where she's buried. So now with the support of the Jesuits, with the support of the Jesuits, by the way, they will later be expelled from Latin America because, precisely for this reason, Spain and Portugal say, "Oh no, we don't want them." With the support of the Jesuits, she becomes even more of a danger. So as the 17th century goes by, Portugal disunites from Spain. The Portuguese crown now decides it's time to put an end to her. In 1675, they send a very cruel conquistador. Do you know that word? The word means conqueror. But when we use it in terms of Renaissance history, it means one of two types of conquerors, Spanish or Portuguese. And the term conquistador is specifically designed to describe those two conquests for reasons, if I can quote Latin American and Latin Americanist historians, that have to do with the cruelty of Spain and Portugal. But we know that England and Holland and France were pretty nasty too. Nonetheless, I want you to understand that the emotional scar left by the Spanish and the Portuguese in these continents is huge. Huge. That's why most Latin American historians prefer the term early modern period to Renaissance. For them it was not much of a Renaissance. So Manuel Galvão, that was his name, Capitan Galvão, leads a huge army to destroy Palmares in 1675. And somehow during that fray, Aqualtune is killed or dies. She passed on her power before she dies. 10 years before she dies, she designates her grandson Zumbi to inherit her power. She had a son named Gangazumba who did not like that, because Gangazumba wanted to break apart the alliance with the whites. Curiously enough, Gangazumba, who appears to be more militant, will be the person who sells out to the Portuguese. Gangazumba, after her death, seizes power. And then, of course, there's a terrible power struggle between Zumbi and Gangazumba. Zumbi takes the power in the name of Aqualtune. Overwhelmingly, people support him. And then he himself is killed in another foray into Palmares in 1695, when Palmares is completely destroyed. What happens? The people who were in Palmares simply go to other quilombos. Let's ask an economic question. They always ask these questions in Brazil. Was she a socialist? Was she a capitalist? I think she was a little bit of both. The quilombo was completely cooperative, so you could say, okay, she sounds like a socialist. Except she was an entrepreneur, and she believed in selling things independently. That's how the quilombos supported themselves, through illegal sales of luxury items. And she was a woman, and she liked camellias. So camellias, ever after in Brazil, have become the symbol of the emancipation movement. And so many years later, am I blocking it? Many years later, in 1888, when slavery is finally abolished in Brazil by a woman, how many of you know that? Isn't it amazing the way women just get princesses of that? In 1888, on the day of the proclamation, Isabel wore 3 camellias. You may think it's just a flower. It happens to have a very real meaning in the context of this history. Why? Because through the sale of camellias, the quilombos supported themselves. Do you understand what they were doing? They were breaking apart the monopoly. Okay, the Portuguese put a monopoly on who you could trade with. Well, suddenly the quilombos were offering goods at a cheaper price. So people began to buy from the quilombos. So this was a bit of a punch in the face to the colonial economic system. Okay, if I can give you a parallel from the English-speaking world, how many of you have ever heard of the Pirates of the Spanish Main? You've heard of the pirates, right? The guys. You've heard of the pirates. What were the pirates doing? Why did people like pirates? Because you could buy goods more cheaply. Right? You had to trade with the crown. That was expensive. The pirates would show up and sell you the goods for cut price. It works. So the quilombos created an entire economic structure because they were economically self-supporting, which is why they continue to this day. Because the quilombos have never disappeared in Brazil. There are approximately, what the Brazilian government reports is 176 quilombos that still exist. And there are over 300 other ones that are looking for recognition. Right? They are populated to a certain degree by the descendants of the original quilombos, and actually more by people from the local rural communities who have joined in this very successful community structure. Well, she got airbrushed out of history in the 19th century, although her grandson didn't. Everyone in Brazil knows Zumbi. November 20th, the day that he was assassinated, is the national day in Brazil of emancipation. White Brazilians celebrate that every bit as much as black Brazilians. In fact, in Brazil, it is a little bit harder to find that paradigm we have in this country, black and white. Not to say they've solved all their problems. They have quite a few. But to a certain degree, as a Brazilian anthropologist, wonderful anthropologist by the name of Darcy Ribeiro pointed out, they are a bit ahead of us on that question. Not so much on the economic question, but in terms of race, they are a bit less fossilized. I'm going to end in 1 second. Let's take a look at the final. The question that, as I was working on this PowerPoint, which I must tell you was put together beautifully by my colleague Kendra, because if I tried putting it together, it wouldn't look as pretty. We asked the question, why are women airbrushed from history? So Kendra very nicely airbrushed these 2 important women from the 17th century. Now we see white women can be airbrushed from history too. You know who you're looking at? You know who the white woman is that you're looking at? The most powerful sovereign of 17th century Europe, Queen Christina. From Sweden, in the days when Sweden was a huge, huge military and naval power. It is very interesting that if we think of the 17th century, we hardly think of these figures. And yet in their times, they were 2 of the most important people. And I want to end bringing us back to the U.S. Somebody whose name you know. But I'm sure you just identify her with the Underground Railroad, and probably much less with her military past. Harriet Tubman, who you know helped to lead the Underground Railroad. You know she was one of the founders of the Underground Railroad. But do you know she also led the raid on Harper's Ferry with John Brown? Do you know that John Brown had her decorated as what he said was his finest military man? Okay. It's interesting to note that when we talk about Harriet Tubman, well, we're not quite as bad as sometimes they are in Brazil, simply calling her Zumbi's grandmother. We do admit that Harriet Tubman had a role in the Underground Railroad, but we rarely mention her military prowess. And we rarely mention the fact that John Brown trusted her more than any of his male generals. So ask yourself that question. You see the airbrush, you see Queen Christina of Sweden, and Aqualtune airbrushed, and there you see them a little bit clearer. I certainly hope at the end of tonight's lecture that at least one of those figures, I'll leave a specialist in Scandinavia to do Queen Christina, but at least one of these figures is a bit clearer to you. Thank you very much.
Before we airbrush Sharonah from the stage, we have about 5 minutes for questions.
Yes.
Do you know anything about your father?
Aqualtune. I know what I have read in the work of that same Brazilian anthropologist, Darcy Ribeiro. There are two versions about her father. One version is that he disinherited Aqualtune because of her military prowess. Another version, by the way, both of these versions come from the same Portuguese chronicles, so God knows. Another version is that he actually was the one who ascended Aqualtune to power because she showed greater strategic and political acumen than either of her brothers. Again, the hard thing with Aqualtune is we're always dealing with second-hand testimony. I'm probably going to guess it was the second, because I believe if her father had disinherited her, I think historically there's no way she could have risen to the position that she rose to. It's obvious, I'm spouting my opinion. I think it's much more likely that she was designated as the heir by her father and her mother together. It's a very good question. Yeah, so again there, with Aqualtune we always have two versions. Depends which person was writing the crime. Z.
Question. Why would she give her power to Zumbi instead of maybe her daughter, Sabina?
Sabina.
Which would be breaking with her matriarchal
Right.
background.
Sabina, according to Brazilian popular tradition, didn't want it. Now, does that mean she didn't want it or not? I don't know. But there are hundreds and hundreds of poems and songs that speak about Sabina did not like war. So Sabina, you can understand that. Sabina in the Quilombo was the one who taught the children. She was a teacher. And she also taught them how to weave. Apparently, all the accounts agree on that point. She did not want anything to do militarily. It's a very good question. And so the question is, why doesn't she designate Gangazumba, her son? She apparently mistrusts him from the beginning. So, he's never designated. So that's interesting. Thank you. Aisha.
I'm wondering, did Capoeira play a role
Ooh, that's a
in
beautiful
this at all?
Okay, that's such a beautiful question. It seems like I planted you there. You know what? The word that Aisha just mentioned, capoeira. Look at it on YouTube. Capoeira is a magnificent form of dance in Brazil that is considered to be also a martial art. That is because it was a martial art. What the slaves would do would be to practice martial arts under the guise of dance. And of course this has survived. If you ever go to Brazil, you can find them here. There are capoeira groups. Even here in Phoenix there are capoeira groups. There are two. Capoeira would have been at that point very clearly military. Because what's interesting here is that it really wasn't hidden for so long. After the first 30 or so years, by about 1530, the Portuguese knew they're not only dancing, are they, but it was a very, very important form of military training. And it also goes back to certain forms of worship and sacred dance that you can find still in Angola. Which also probably means she was Angola's. Yes?
The northern part of Brazil is all the Amazon forest. Did some of these groups go into the forest
Well,
along
That's a good question. The northern part is, on the coast is not the Amazon. The coast is actually where the Portuguese always settled. The Amazon was the area you ran to get away from Portuguese colonization. That is what the Tupi-Guarani Indians do at the beginning. You know, because the original plan is to enslave the Tupi-Guarani. The Portuguese were already enslaving in Africa, by the way. They'd gotten there earlier, but originally there was no plan to bring slaves from Africa. It was when the Tupi-Guarani just start running away that they decide to bring slaves from Africa. At the same time, what's interesting is that many quilombos actually sprouted up within the Amazon. And in Brazil today, there are over 50, I don't know the exact number, I do know it is over 50, they always say that on the news in Brazil, quilombos that have really remained intact from the 17th century on. So that's interesting.